The wind bit at Marcus's face as he pedaled through the heavy mist. The rain-soaked cardboard packages in his basket shifted with every bump in the road, threatening to slip free. He had been at it for hours, the cold sinking into his bones. But today, there was something different. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the ache in his muscles. Marcus had long since learned how to ignore the cruel glances and muttered words that followed him wherever he went. Probably doesn't even know what he's doing. The worst were the customers, the ones who wouldn't meet his eyes when he handed them their package, or who subtly stepped back as if his presence was somehow offensive. As he approached his next stop, a well-dressed man with slicked-back hair stood by the door of a luxury apartment complex. He could already feel the eyes on him, the silent judgment in the air. The man didn't look up. After a moment, he finally snatched the package from Marcus's hands, his grip tight and dismissive. Marcus forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stood there for a moment, watching the man's figure retreat into the building, his back straight, his steps deliberate, as if he were making sure Marcus knew he wasn't welcome. The cold, the exhaustion, the pain in his legs, it all felt worse when he was treated this way. He had learned to swallow his pride, to walk away, even as his soul bled, the sting of that man's indifference. This wasn't just a job, a constant struggle to survive, to endure, to be seen for who he truly was. The ache in his legs worsened as he pedaled down the empty street. The exhaustion and loneliness were familiar, but today, something else weighed heavily on him, an anger he couldn't shake. He knew the world didn't care. It was part of the game. Was it worth waking up every day to be treated like this? The rain started to pick up again, drenching him further as he pedaled through the wet streets. For a moment he considered it. The wind whipped against him, pushing him forward. The sound of his bike tires skimming the wet pavement was the only noise in the stillness of the street. Inside, the warm air hit him like a soft embrace, the faint smell of incense mixing with the lingering scent of wood. He made his way to the back, leaning his bike against the wall. The sound of traffic, the constant rush of people, the stares, the whispers, the judgments, all of it seemed to vanish for a while. He wasn't sure what he was searching for. Maybe just a moment of peace, or maybe a sense of belonging. As he stood there, the quiet hum of the world outside crept back in, seeping into the silence like a slow tide. But even with all the noise, the silence of his own mind pressed harder than ever. "Hey, you okay?" The voice startled him. She had a kind face, but Marcus could see the lines of exhaustion there too. "Tired," he replied, forcing a smile. "I get it." He didn't want to talk about it. "I feel like I'm invisible sometimes," he admitted, quietly, more to himself than to her. "I know the feeling. I know it doesn't make everything better, but you are." He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the exhaustion. "Thanks." As she did, Marcus noticed a soft flicker of light coming from the altar at the front of the church. He had seen this church countless times, but never felt the urge to step inside. He walked slowly to the front, his worn boots echoing against the wooden floors. As he stood there, staring at the small cross hanging above the altar, something shifted. It was then that the door to the church opened again and a man walked in. Something familiar. Then he turned to Marcus, a gentle smile on his face. "But know this, brother. You are not forgotten." Marcus stood frozen. But something inside him, something raw and aching, held him in place. The man stepped closer, his eyes soft but penetrating. The one who sees when others look away. "You are heard." Marcus swallowed, the weight of those words settling heavy in his chest. He needed to. "Every day feels like I'm invisible. I understand the pain of being overlooked. You are not defined by their rejection, nor their prejudice, and that is what matters." Tears pricked the corners of Marcus's eyes, but he blinked them away. It felt too vulnerable. "I don't know what to do," Marcus confessed, the weight of the years pressing in on him. "You're not fighting alone." It wasn't just the man standing before him, but something more. A presence that made him feel seen, a spark of hope, a light flickering in the darkness. Not now. Marcus stood there, the silence settling back over him. The next few days passed in a blur. Something about the man's words had stuck with him, an echo that wouldn't fade, but the weight of that moment of feeling seen had changed him just a little. The packages in his basket, the cold, the exhaustion, it was all the same, the sound of car doors slamming in his face. Today, though, was different. The high-rise apartment building loomed. Ahead, its glass windows reflecting the dull grey sky. The usual buzz of indifference. The man who came to collect his package wasn't like the others. There was no hesitation, no subtle step back. "Thank you," the man said, his voice calm but genuine. He hadn't expected kindness, at least not here, not in this part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was real. He nodded, unable to speak at first. The words the stranger had said lingered in his mind. Genuine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere. And in that small act of kindness, something stirred in him, something that had been buried beneath years of pain and frustration. Maybe the world wasn't entirely indifferent, but as he continued on his route, the weight of reality settled back in. A door slammed in his face, a few harsh words thrown his way. Small moments of kindness didn't erase the years of struggle, but they mattered. That he wasn't the sum of the stares or the slams or the harsh words. Later that night, as Marcus returned home, he sat in the dim light of his apartment, the faint hum of the city outside his window. There was something about him, something that went beyond the words he had spoken, a promise that he wasn't alone, even when it felt like the world was against him. A message from his sister. How's everything? How could he explain everything to her? The exhaustion, the loneliness that came with it. He typed back a simple reply. Just tired. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. As he sat there, he felt that familiar pull, the weight of the struggle, a flicker of hope. The idea that maybe, just maybe, things could change. More than the constant humiliation. But deep down, Marcus knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world didn't change overnight, but something had shifted in him. Just a little bit. But he wasn't willing to give up hope. "You are my child." Maybe not entirely, but enough to keep going. Another ride. But it would be one more step forward. The weather had taken a turn, clouds hanging low in the sky, threatening rain again. The city was still quiet when he left his apartment, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by. The same tiredness that came from endless days of delivering packages, dealing with indifference, and facing the constant sting of racism. He had woken with a quiet sense of purpose, a sense that today might be the day he found something more than just the routine he had become so accustomed to. Whatever it was, he felt a flicker of hope, however small. The smell of rain hung in the air, mixing with the fumes from passing cars. It was the same luxury building from yesterday, and he could already feel the weight of judgment hanging in the air. She looked at him, her eyes flicking over him as if he were an inconvenience. "Carter?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. She just held out her hand, taking the package from him without meeting his gaze. She didn't even acknowledge his presence beyond the transaction, but she didn't. It wasn't the worst he'd been treated, but it still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He shook it off and continued down the street. He had learned to live with it. As he pedaled through the rain, his thoughts turned to the conversation he had in the church. "You are my child." He was more than the job he did. People saw him as a delivery worker, a means to an end. They saw him as a black man, just another stereotype to fit into a mold they had created. And no matter how many times he tried to rise above it, the world kept pushing him down. A young man opened the door, took the package from Marcus, and then said, "You know, I don't usually order stuff from you people." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that, but each time it felt like a blow. The man looked him up and down, a smug expression on his face. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. But something held him back. And what would it matter anyway? Without saying another word, he turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached his next stop, the day felt like an endless cycle of pain. Every door slammed, every harsh word, every dismissive glance, it all added up. "You are not forgotten." Marcus paused for a moment, his bike parked in front of the next building. The voice was still there, faint but persistent. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but the words gave him something to hold on to. Not anymore. Maybe today wasn't the day he'd find justice, but it was a step closer. The door opened, and a woman stood on the other side. "Package for Mrs." The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice warm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It wasn't much, but it was something. The rain had finally stopped, but the wet pavement glistened under the dim streetlights. It was the quiet, daily battle that no one saw. The racism. But something had shifted in him. Lopez, the words of the man in the church, and even the brief kindness from the customer yesterday, those moments had become more than just brief respites, reminders that he was human, that he was seen. Marcus could feel the stares and the whispers lingering even when no one was around. It always was. The scent of fresh grass hung in the air, and the houses looked like something out of a picture-perfect postcard. Behind those perfectly white fences, there was still judgment. He approached the door, his shoulders tense. He rang the doorbell, waiting. She was dressed in a neatly pressed blouse, her hair done up perfectly, and her expression was cold, almost detached. "Nelson?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the encounter. She took the package from him without saying a word, her gaze never meeting his. Marcus nodded and turned to leave. "You know, we don't need people like you working in our neighborhood." Marcus stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to respond, but the words were trapped in his throat. There was nothing he could say to change the woman's mind. He didn't look back, but the sting of her words stayed with him, cutting deeper than any of the others. He had to be. The stares, the racist comments. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment. There was no time for anything but the next stop, the next delivery, the next round of humiliation. The voice from the church, the words from the man who had spoken to him in the dim light of that sacred space, they echoed in his mind. "You are my child." The world outside was still, silent, almost too quiet. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep him moving forward. The door opened and a man stood on the other side. "Package for Mr." The man smiled, a genuine smile, and took the package from him. "You doing all right?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the kindness. "Just tired." The man nodded, his expression softening. "Been a long day for me, too." He just nodded, his throat tight. It was a small moment, but it felt like something more, and maybe, just maybe, he could hold on to that. The sun, which had barely pierced the grey clouds in the past few days, shone through in quiet rays that warmed Marcus's skin as he rode through the streets. Instead, there was something lighter in the air, something that made his heart beat a little faster, his legs move a little more steadily. Johnson, the brief but human exchange, lingered in his mind. Maybe the world wasn't all harsh and cruel. Maybe there was more to life than the endless stream of prejudice he faced each day. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Just remember to keep your head up." Caught. He had been dreading it since the moment he found out. A complaint from a customer who claimed Marcus was aggressive while delivering a package. But that didn't matter. It didn't matter how many times he'd been treated like dirt. When it came down to it, he was the one who would be scrutinized, the one who would be blamed. As Marcus pedaled through the city, his thoughts swirled. What if things went wrong today? What if he found himself caught in a system that didn't care? And he knew deep down that the trial wasn't just about the ticket or the accusation. It was about something bigger. He arrived at the courthouse and stood outside for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The courthouse was for people who mattered. He walked inside, the cold marble floors echoing under his boots. He took a deep breath and forced himself to steady his shaking hands. He turned to see the bailiff motioning for him to step forward. He stood in front of the judge, a woman who looked to be in her mid-50s, her sharp eyes assessing him with a quiet intensity. "Mr. How do you plead?" Marcus opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came. He had worked so hard to make sure nothing went wrong. But here he was, standing in a courtroom, forced to defend himself against something that wasn't even true. "I'm just trying to do my job." The judge didn't respond right away, her gaze still fixed on him. "I see." "Yes," Marcus replied, his chest tight. And then, she did something Marcus never expected. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the desk. "Thompson." Marcus blinked, stunned. It wasn't just the relief that flooded his chest. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in so long. He wasn't the accusation that had been made against him. The judge's voice softened as she continued, "I know what it's like to be overlooked, to be assumed guilty before you even speak. I don't believe you intended to cause any harm." Marcus stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to catch up with the words. "You're free to go." As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment hit him. He had won something far more important. He had been seen. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he might just be able to face them head on. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long, those years of feeling invisible, the constant sting of being misunderstood, the bitter taste of prejudice, seemed to lift, even if just a little. It wasn't just the legal victory that mattered, but the way the judge had seen him, had believed him. But even as the lightness settled into his chest, he knew the fight wasn't over. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and neither would the way people saw him. Something inside him had shifted. He felt a flicker of pride in the way he carried himself, even as he rode his bike down the busy streets. But now, it was as though he could see them with fresh eyes. He was Marcus Thompson, and no one could take that from him. As he rode up, the glossy windows reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. It was just another delivery. He had done it 1,000 times. The door swung open before he even had a chance to ring the bell. "Package for Ms." The woman looked at him for a moment, then snatched the package from his hands without saying a word. But this time, something was different. He stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Still, Marcus felt something stir inside him. It wasn't the best he'd ever had, but it was a far cry from the humiliation he had so often faced. It wasn't much, but it mattered. The sting of the morning's encounters had faded, replaced by a subtle but growing strength. When he finally returned to his apartment, his legs were sore, his body tired from the long day, but there was a lightness to his step. He had stood up for himself in the face of a system that didn't always listen. The feeling lingered as he sat down at his small kitchen table, staring out the window at the dimming skyline. But now as he looked out over the streets, he saw something different. Maybe things wouldn't be easy, but he didn't need to be seen by them. He had his own back now. The next few days passed with a quiet shift in Marcus. It was subtle, a small change, barely noticeable to anyone else. But for Marcus, it was everything. Each encounter, no matter how brief or cold, seemed less crushing than before. He was learning to let them slide off him like water. He had learned something important in the last few weeks, something he hadn't fully realized until now. His value wasn't defined by their rejection or their narrow views, but the battle wasn't over. He still had to navigate a world that too often saw him as less than. The small victories, like the kindness from Mrs. Johnson and the judge's decision, had begun to pile up in a way that gave him the strength to keep moving forward. The air had a slight chill to it, the kind of weather that made the city seem quieter, more introspective. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it, a shift, like the world around him was changing, even if just a little. Maybe this was the beginning of something. He reached the next stop on his route, a bustling cafe in the city's downtown district. As he walked up to the door, he spotted a familiar face inside, a man he had delivered to a few times before. Marcus approached the counter, his bike parked outside, and waited for the man to notice him. The man looked up and smiled. Marcus nodded. "You're always delivering, huh? Must take a lot of patience." Marcus felt a surprising warmth spread through him. It felt different than the usual indifference he faced. "But it pays the i.e. bills?" The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "There are a lot of people like you out there. People who do hard work and don't get the credit they deserve. I just wanted to say thanks." "Thanks," he said, his throat tight. For the first time in a long while, someone had taken the time to truly see him, not as a delivery driver, but as a person. As the man turned back to his work, Marcus stood there for a moment, trying to absorb the moment. And it wasn't just a fleeting moment, that he mattered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but it was there, lingering in the air around him. He sat down on his worn couch, his body aching from the day's work, but his mind felt lighter than it had in a long time. The fight against prejudice and inequality wasn't over, and in that quiet, dimly lit apartment, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The next few days felt almost like a dream. He walked taller, spoke a little louder, and smiled more, even when the world around him seemed determined to pull him back into the shadows. As he pedaled through the streets, the familiar hum of the city felt less oppressive. But it didn't matter the way it used to. He had learned to let it slide off him, just as he had learned to keep moving forward despite the world trying to stop him. The wet pavement gleamed like glass, reflecting the city's skyline. His first stop of the day was an apartment complex on the edge of the city. The air felt thick with the weight of the city's struggles, a mixture of poverty and opportunity that never quite met in the middle. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired, but there was something about her that made Marcus pause. "Turner," he asked, his voice steady. For a moment she didn't respond, and Marcus could feel the tension hanging in the air. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger now. "Sure." She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "Like they don't really see you." The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Marcus didn't know how to respond. No one had ever bothered to really see him. "I've felt that way most of my life." The woman nodded, her face softening. "I do. I see you." It wasn't the first time someone had acknowledged his humanity, but something about the way she said it made him feel like the world wasn't as cold and indifferent as he had always believed. Marcus stood there for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He didn't know this woman, but in that brief exchange she had given him something invaluable: acknowledgement, recognition, validation. The rest of the day passed in a blur, each stop feeling like a small victory. He was still tired, still fighting the same battles, but the burden didn't feel as heavy as it once had. He had delivered dozens of packages, faced countless people, but it was this last stop that stuck with him. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with expensive artwork and polished floors. He rang the bell and waited, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. "Package for Ms." The woman took the package from his hands without a word, her fingers brushing his skin in a way that felt colder than the air around them. Marcus stood there for a moment, the familiar sting of indifference threatening to settle in. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought about leaving without saying anything. Let the world keep turning in its cold, indifferent way. He turned back to her, standing tall in the doorway, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not just some delivery guy." She didn't respond right away, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Maybe it was something else. She closed the door without another word, but this time it didn't feel like a dismissal. Marcus stood there for a moment, the weight of his own words settling over him. The world might not change today, but it was changing inside him. The days that followed felt almost surreal. It wasn't that the struggles had disappeared. It was more like he had found a new strength to face them. The world hadn't changed, but his perception of it had. But with each turn of the pedals, Marcus felt like he was becoming more and more the person he had always wanted to be. Someone who no longer accepted the world's judgments, who no longer internalized the hurt, the racism, and the prejudice. He had learned that his worth wasn't defined by how others saw him. by the racism he encountered, or by the job he did. He wasn't just a black man. The mornings were still quiet, the air still cool, but there was a difference now. The city didn't feel as cold. As he rode through the familiar streets, he couldn't help but notice the small shifts in his daily routine. The woman at the building who took the time to thank him, not just for the delivery, but for his service. Marcus had become a quiet force, not by demanding change from others, but by changing himself. First, he had learned that his validation came from within. Some days were harder than others, and there were still those moments when the weight of the world pressed against him, when the harsh words, the slamming doors, and the cold shoulders threatened to break him. He had learned to let those moments pass, to let the sting of them fade, because he knew who he was. He was someone who mattered. The street was the same, the faces of the people passing by just as indifferent as they had always been, but today it felt different. As he reached his next stop, a young man opened the door. This one was different. "Hey man, thank you," the young man said, taking the package from Marcus with genuine appreciation. "No problem." The young man paused for a moment, his eyes soft. "I just wanted to say you're doing great." He hadn't been expecting this kind of recognition. "Thanks," Marcus said, his throat tight. It wasn't just the satisfaction of having done his job, and maybe, just maybe, he could help others see that too. The small victories like this one had added up over time, shaping the man he was becoming. By the time he finished his deliveries for the day, the city was quiet. As he made his way back home, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He was stronger, wiser, and more confident in his own worth. But Marcus had learned that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought against the world, but against the voices inside that told him he wasn't enough. As he stood outside his apartment, looking up at the city that had always been both a battleground and a sanctuary, Marcus felt a sense of peace wash over him. The days rolled on, each one bringing its own set of challenges and rewards, but still, he felt a pull, an urge to do more, to make a real difference. It was on one of these quiet afternoons, after a long stretch of deliveries, that Marcus received a call that would set everything in motion. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he answered, a familiar voice greeted him. She was one of the few friends he had made at work, a fellow delivery driver who had always been more kind and understanding than most. "What's up?" Marcus asked, leaning against his bike as he spoke into the phone. "There's a protest happening tomorrow, and they want you to speak." Marcus stood up straight, a chill running down his spine. "You mean, like, in front of everyone?" "Yeah," Marissa replied, her tone serious now. "They want someone who's been in the trenches, who knows what it's like to face racism, humiliation, and all the stuff we deal with every day." The thought of speaking in front of a crowd, of sharing his story, his personal battles, the hurt, the quiet resilience, it terrified him. It was a chance to not only stand up for himself, but for all the people like him who had been overlooked for too long. "Marcus," Marissa said gently, "you've been through so much and you've come so far. You don't have to be perfect. Trust me, people need to hear it." Marcus was silent for a long moment. He thought about the moments of kindness, the ones that had kept him going, and how small they had felt compared to the weight of everything else. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll speak." The decision hit him harder than he had expected, but now here he was, agreeing to stand up and tell the world what it had been like, what it still was like, to be black and a delivery worker, to be dismissed, to be mistreated, to be invisible. The park was filled with people, some holding signs, others milling about in quiet conversation. It was different from anything Marcus had ever experienced. This was the kind of solidarity he had only ever dreamed of. "There you are," she said, clapping him on the back. He took a deep breath and nodded. His heart raced as he made his way to the stage, the mic waiting for him. For a moment, he hesitated, but now, in this moment, he had the chance to change that. Taking the mic in his hand, Marcus stood at the edge of the stage and looked out over the crowd. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He took a deep breath and began. "And I'm here because I'm tired of being invisible. I've spent too many years riding my bike through these streets, delivering packages only to be ignored, humiliated, and treated like I don't exist." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. "I've faced racism every day of my life," he continued, his voice growing steadier, stronger. "I thought I had to keep my head down, to take it and keep going. We don't have to let them treat us like we're nothing. We deserve respect." He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the invisible. But the feeling that washed over him wasn't fear. Something he hadn't felt in years. The applause echoed in Marcus's ears long after the crowd had fallen silent. He had spoken the truth, the raw, painful truth about what it was like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than. His voice. Some people even had tears in their eyes. The applause felt like a dream, something he hadn't dared hope for. When he stepped off the stage, Marissa was there, her face lit with a proud smile. That was amazing. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes stinging. "But I had to. You changed things." He looked around at the faces of the crowd, people who had gathered not just to hear him speak, but to find strength in each other. They were tired, frustrated, but also filled with something new. The belief that they were worthy of respect, worthy of being seen. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like just a delivery driver. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had given a voice to so many others who had never been heard. It wasn't just a protest, it was a celebration of resilience. That night, as he rode home, Marcus's thoughts swirled. He had stood up and been heard. For so long, he had carried the belief that the world would never change, that no matter how hard he fought, he would always be pushed to the margins. They had all shared in that moment, and now they carried that strength with them. Far from it, a turning point. The city around him was just as loud, just as indifferent, as it had always been. He had done something that mattered. The next day, Marcus woke up to a storm of notifications on his phone. Social media was buzzing with hashtags like "Seen and Heard" and "Respect Delivery Workers." People from across the country, black, delivery workers, white delivery workers, workers of every color and creed, were reaching out, sharing their own experiences, thanking him for speaking up. But amidst the flood of messages and news stories, one message stood out. It was from the woman at the church, the one who had spoken to him the day he'd first stepped into that sacred space, the one who had told him he was seen. "You're making a difference." It was simple, but it was exactly what Marcus needed to hear in that moment. It always had. The battle for justice was long, and it was far from over. He had a voice now, a voice that had been heard, and that meant everything. He felt the strength to answer them, to speak to those who had been touched by his words, to offer them a bit of hope. He wasn't just delivering packages anymore. He was delivering the message that he mattered. The world had always been hard on Marcus, but now, for the first time in his life, Marcus felt that the world was starting to shift, quietly, and he would be there to witness it. The world around him hadn't changed overnight, but something had shifted, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just the world that had shifted. It was him. Every turn of the pedals felt purposeful. Every stop at a customer's door, a chance to remind himself and the world that he was more than what others had always seen. It was overwhelming at times, but also empowering. One afternoon, after a long shift, Marcus sat at a small cafe, scrolling through his messages. "Marcus Thompson?" the man asked, his voice tentative but familiar. It was a reporter, a local news anchor he had seen on TV before. The reporter smiled and sat down across from him. "I've been following your story for a while now, and we'd love to do an interview with you about the rally and the impact it's had. People are paying attention." The offer caught Marcus off guard. He just wanted to speak the truth, to be heard. "I'm not sure what I'd say," Marcus replied, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't plan on starting a movement." John chuckled. "Just one person standing up and saying, 'This is my truth.' You've given so many others the courage to speak up too." I don't want to be some hero, that's all. And that's exactly why people need to hear your story. You're doing it because it matters. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility begin to settle on his shoulders. This was about all the workers who had been overlooked, all the people who had been treated like they didn't matter. I'll do the interview. John's face lit up. We'll set it up for next week. You're making a difference. As Marcus walked out of the cafe, he felt the familiar nervousness settle in his stomach. He wasn't someone who sought attention, and for the first time he felt like his voice could make a difference, even if it was just for one person. The story of the black delivery driver who had spoken up about racism, about the daily struggles of people like him, reached beyond the local news. But as the attention grew, so did the pressure. He had gone from being an invisible worker, overlooked and dismissed, to someone people were now looking to for change. He took a long ride one evening to clear his mind, riding through the neighborhoods he had grown up in, the streets he knew like the back of his hand. It was about something much deeper. He didn't need to change the world all at once. The rest would follow. It was from his sister. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. Keep pushing. He wasn't sure if he was making history, but he knew one thing. He was making a difference. The world was paying attention now, and Marcus found himself in places he had never imagined. Radio interviews, meetings with local leaders, and even coffee with a few activists who had been fighting for workers' rights for years. It was humbling and overwhelming. The world was watching him now, waiting for him to lead. But now, he was being asked to speak for the people who had never been heard, to stand up for the workers who were still invisible in the eyes of so many. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the streets. The people around him, the ones who had always seemed distant, now seemed connected. He had found his voice, and in doing so had given others the courage to find theirs. He wasn't in this for fame or attention. The rallying cry for workers' rights had grown louder, and the movement was spreading. The world hadn't changed overnight, and it wouldn't change in the blink of an eye. Each person who joined the fight, each person who spoke out, was a victory. They were planning a larger national rally in a few months, and they wanted him to be the keynote speaker. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of responsibility. But then he remembered the faces of the people he had met along the way, people who had shared their stories with him, people who had felt the same pain he had, people who had been overlooked for too long. And he realized that this wasn't about him. It was about speaking the truth. I'll speak. The rally day arrived with an electric energy that was palpable. People from all walks of life had gathered to demand change. Workers, activists, community leaders, and even people who had never worked a day in the delivery industry but felt called to stand with the workers who were so often forgotten. He had spoken at rallies before, but this was different. His face would be broadcast to millions. His words would echo far beyond the crowd that stood before him. When it was his turn, Marcus walked to the stage, the crowd's cheers rising up around him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. He took the microphone, his breath steadying as he looked out over the sea of faces. We're here today because we're tired of being invisible. We're here today because we matter. Every day we face racism, disrespect, and disregard. But I'm here to tell you that we do exist. And we're not going anywhere. The crowd roared, and Marcus could feel the power of the moment, a power that came not from him, but from the collective strength of everyone in that crowd. And together, they could change things. We deserve to be seen. We are not invisible. The movement was no longer just a series of small rallies. It was a revolution. As Marcus finished his speech, he stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that the world was finally starting to listen. His speech had ignited something in the hearts of countless people. His words had been shared thousands of times, picked up by activists and even labor unions that were eager to support the growing movement. He had expected things to change, but what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply the movement would begin to affect him personally. People who had been struggling with similar issues shared their own stories of being invisible and dismissed. In the weeks that followed, Marcus was invited to more and more discussions. Meetings with activists, labor organizations, and even politicians who wanted to hear about the struggles delivery workers faced daily. He had spoken up for the voiceless, and now people were listening. The systems that had allowed workers to be treated as invisible were deeply entrenched, and the corporations that relied on the labor of people like Marcus fought back fiercely, lobbying against changes to working conditions. Workers were demanding better pay, safer working conditions, and most importantly, respect. It wasn't about fame. It was about something far deeper, the dignity of the people who were still being treated like they didn't matter. One afternoon, Marcus found himself at a community center, speaking to a group of workers who had gathered to discuss their rights. He spoke with the same honesty and conviction that had come to define him. You matter. You are the backbone of this city, and you are not invisible anymore. And change is coming. The workers in the room nodded, some of them tearfully, others with expressions of quiet determination. They were no longer passive in their struggle. After his speech, a woman approached him. "You don't know what this means to us," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "like our work doesn't count." "You're not alone," he said. It wasn't about one person anymore. It was about the collective power of everyone who had ever been overlooked, underpaid, or dismissed. And that was just the beginning. The movement Marcus had helped spark began to pick up steam, and slowly but surely, things began to change. There were talks of better health benefits for delivery workers, safer work environments, and more transparency in the way they were compensated. They had learned to stand up for themselves, to speak their truth, and to demand what they were owed. As the movement grew, so did Marcus's sense of purpose. He was a leader, a voice for those who had been unheard for so long. What mattered was the change he was helping to create, the dignity he was restoring. The city outside his window was quiet, the lights flickering on as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had all brought him to this moment, this point where he could say with certainty, "I am enough." He wasn't just Marcus Thompson, the delivery driver. The road ahead was still long, and the struggle was far from over. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful thing of all.